Hey guys and gals, today we're going to do a new lecture on Reddit psychology, and we're going to start out with behavioral genetics and evolutionary psychology. So this sort of goes back to the initial question we had in that first lecture, which is how do genes and environment interact to make us who we are? Now before we can get into that question, first we have to understand what we mean by both genes and environment. So let's start off with the genetic component. Each and every one of us is born with 23 unique pairs of chromosomes. Now, we get these chromosomes from our parents. So we get half of our genetic material from mom and the other half from dad. And what this comes down to is, since we each have 23 pairs of chromosomes, we then pass off one of each of those pairs to our genetic offspring. So that's part of why each and every individual sperm and egg are so unique, because you have 23 different possibilities, but then you've got 23 different possibilities plus the fact that they could send off one chromosome or they could send off the other. So the actual number of possibilities is far higher than anything that you might imagine. So we have almost an infinite supply of genetic possibility. It's really quite impressive. So we've got these groups of chromosomes, right? We've got these pairs of chromosomes from mom and dad. In each chromosome, some of them have specific functions. For instance, down here we see X and Y, and these are the ones that determine whether or not we're going to be born male or female. But for the most part, each of these have interesting functions that develop into who we become. Some of them have what we call nonsense strings, but they're repetitive strings that actually do serve a purpose. They're just not something that makes you different. So what does a chromosome contain? Well, the chromosome is made up of genes. And these genes are strings of DNA that code for a specific protein. So each strand of DNA is made up of guanine, adenine, cytosine, and leucine. So each of these four components come together to create amino acids. And when you put the amino acids together, those code for proteins. So what our body is actually doing is just creating a whole mess of proteins. Now, it sounds unusual to think that all of your behavioral characteristics, all of your physical characteristics, all of that comes down to proteins. But it's true. That's actually what makes up every aspect of who you are those proteins that your body codes for. Now, the genes that code for the specific proteins can be turned on or off. So there's this really excellent example of a moth, right? So depending on the season, the environment will turn on or off a specific color gene. So that during fall, these moths blend in very well with their environment with a brown shade, whereas during the spring they have more of a vibrant green, and that's because it's advantageous for the environment. So that's a perfect example of the environment impacting your genes and how these genes can be turned on or off. So I mentioned nonsense genes earlier. Well, that's part of why we're all so similar. When it comes down to it, humans have less than a single percent difference. That means that I am 99.9% the same as you. That's it. 99.9% the same. Isn't that ridiculous? Well, turns out we're actually pretty similar to chimps too. 96% similar. Even farther down, bananas. And they don't even have brains. We're 50% similar with them. So a lot of this is because it's all coding for similar proteins, and these proteins do various important functions for us. So, we all have the need to code for proteins for, proper blood. We want to make sure that our blood works properly when it comes to taking oxygen into our bodies. So, there's no real need for that to be that different between species, and so it winds up being remarkably similar. Now, our traits and what makes us different all falls down into this 0.1%. Everything that makes us different, personality-wise, comes down to this 0.1%, which means, quite rightly, that our genetic code and our genetic structure must be huge. And that's the case. So when we want to look at the impact of environment on genes, and what I mean by the environment is not only the United States or the forest or the desert. I'm not talking about necessarily physical environment. We have different types of environment. Sure, we have the physical environment, and that physical environment is very important. We have some students all the way over in Malta, and they might be very different when it comes to how they were raised and what their environment is from our students who are in the United States. And again, they're going to be very different from our students who are raised in Sweden. So we have a lot of environmental things when it comes to cultural experiences. But that's not all there is to environment. There's also the household you were raised in. But there's also the individual experiences that you have. And those individual experiences, as we'll come to find out, are pretty damn important. So one of the ways that we look at how genes and environment interact is by looking at twin studies. So one of the most common forms of twin studies is looking at identical versus fraternal twins. So we look at the similarities and the differences between these types of twins. So an identical twin is when a single sperm and a single egg collide to create a single embryo. That embryo then splits to generate two different people. Fraternal twins, on the other side, are two separate eggs, two separate sperm, and they develop into two separate fetuses. So in the end, you're still born with, or you still have two babies. But on the identical end, they have the exact same genetic material. On the fraternal end, they do not have the exact same genetic material. In fact, they're just about as similar as regular old run-of-the-mill siblings. There's, technically speaking, no real difference when it comes to their genetic makeup than, say, myself and my sister who's 3 years older. So sharing the womb doesn't necessarily make you more similar. It's all about that genetic material and what you're born with. But as we learned in the first lecture, and as I'm going to post a link to in just a moment or later on when I post this on Reddit, you're going to see that there's actually the possibility for unique experiences to happen within the womb and outside of the womb that can greatly change the personality, the physical appearance, basically a lot about what those identical twins become. Now, when it comes down to the research, what we see across the board is that identical twins are far more similar than fraternal twins. So, if one twin has, this is an example, I'm making the numbers up. Please don't cite me on these numbers because I am making them up. Let's say that we have one twin who has depression. Their identical twin may be 60% more likely to have depression just because they have an identical twin that has depression. Whereas fraternal twins might be only 30% as likely to share that trait. And that's in large part because of that interaction between genes and environment. So they have that genetic predisposition, but there's still some environment going on to impact that. Now, if I say that identical twins are more similar than fraternal, could it possibly be because those parents treat the identical twins as identical twins? So you see parents pushing around those identical twins in the exact same outfits. And you can't tell them apart by looking at them, and they're always treated the same. Well, it turns out that that's actually not what's driving this similarity. They've controlled for that in different studies where they've looked at whether or not a parent treats identical twins as the same individual or two very distinct individuals. And what they find is that it doesn't matter. That similarity is there no matter how the parents treat them. Now, we can look at identical versus fraternal, and that's very interesting. But another thing that we can look at is separated at birth studies. So separated at birth studies are a really unique opportunity that's only been around for a very short period of time. So when two identical twins are put up for adoption, they get sent away to different families, and we can then study them if we find out about them. We can find them. We can learn about their behavioral characteristics and who they are as individuals. And what we'll find is that oftentimes they're very similar. So the most famous is these two gentlemen right here. And these are the Jim twins. Coincidentally, they both happen to be named Jim, which is why they're named the Jim twins. So they were adopted out, I think, like 38 days after birth. So very soon after birth. And they were adopted by different families. Not that far apart, but far enough apart that they never knew each other until they were, I believe, in their 30s. They wound up marrying women with the exact same name. They got divorced from those exact same women, and then married women with the exact same name again. They named their son the exact same thing, with a slight difference in spelling. I believe the middle name was Alan, and for one child, one Jim named it Alan, and the other named it Allan. They have the same hobbies. They both enjoy carpentry. They both enjoy drinking the same beer and smoking the same cigarettes. Now, this seems like it's a little bit too crazy for it to be coincidence. I mean, that seems pretty darn unlikely for them to have all these similarities. But do you really think that there's any gene that codes for cigarette preference or alcohol preference? Well, this is a perfect example of the all too famous quote in psychology, which is that data is not the plural of anecdotes. So we have these interesting anecdotes, and they're really fascinating and they're fun to look at. But the fact of the matter is that we cannot draw wide conclusions from these two individuals. So what we need is more separated at birth twin studies. And as we do those, we'll find that there are a lot of genetic similarities, absolutely, but we'll find that it's probably coincidental that they happen to have two wives with the exact same names. A strange coincidence indeed, but more than likely coincidental. One of the reasons for these similarities, at least in terms of hobbies and habits, is that oftentimes when twins are put up for adoption, the adoption counselors, when choosing a home for the twins, don't feel that it's fair to put one twin in a more advantaged environment than the other twin, and so the twins often get placed in very similar households. So we see that not only are the genes identical, but the environments that they're placed into are also very, very similar. So that may be part of the reason for these coincidental findings. Now, in addition to your basic twin study and your separated at birth study, we have another interesting way of looking at gene-environment interactions, and that's through the use of adoption studies. So you can see down here we've got the Jolie Pitt family. They're a perfect example of adoption, and how we could possibly examine these children to see what part of their personality, behavior, and physical development is the result of the genes that they got from their parents, and what result is from the relationship that they have with their adoptive parents and the experiences that they have growing up. Now, what we find is that personality, and we're going to learn about this later on, personality is largely set at an early age because, for the most part, it's pretty darn genetic. There's a very small range of possibility when it comes to your personality. Sure, it's open to impact from the environment, absolutely, but the range is so small that the environment can only do so much. So for that reason, personalities are largely genetic. This is part of why siblings are actually so different. I was born with different genetic material than my sister was born with. Heck, you can take one look at us and you can tell that we are very, very different. We have different physical ailments. You know, I have a rare genetic skin condition. She doesn't have it at all. That's because of the genetic impact that we were born with. Now we have these different personalities, but what can parents do? Well, parents aren't hopeless. They can't do nothing. Everything's not set by genes. So if personality is largely genetically based, what's largely environmentally based? We find that things like attitudes and values and faith and manners, those are what parents can impact more than anything else. So your parent can't make you more extroverted. They can't make you more agreeable. But they can make you more polite at the table. They can make you more religious or less religious. They can make you more Republican or less, or less Republican, or more liberal or less liberal. And this is why parenting is so important, because you do have a strong impact on who your children develop into. But there are certain things that are largely set by genetics, and you have to work within that framework. So one of the other reasons why siblings are so different, and this is a very genetic factor, is what's known as temperament. So there are a lot of ways of looking at temperament, but I'm going to use one of the most basic forms, which is looking at easy, difficult, and slow to warm up. So temperament is something that you're born with. It's a trait that it's ingrained in your very being, and it impacts how you develop throughout your whole life. So about 65% of babies are easily classifiable into this three-pronged system. And like I said, there are more complex ways of looking at temperament, but this is one of the most basic and easiest ways to look at it. So most children are easy. What I mean by easy is that they're cheerful and they're relaxed. For the most part. I mean, of course, they're going to cry and they're going to have moments. But for the most part, they smile and they giggle and they're happy. Difficult babies are very irritable, and they get really intense emotional reactions. So if something doesn't go right, they're prone to screaming or crying. So they're a lot more sensitive. Slow to warm up, those children are very slow to accommodating to new circumstances. So they're largely inactive. And when new circumstances develop, they take a while getting used to it. So what we see is most babies are easy, the fewest amount are difficult, and about 15% are slow to warm up. Now, one of the reasons why we know that this is almost exclusively genetic is that identical twins almost always have the same temperament. So we gotta feel terrible for those men and women that have twins in this difficult range. That sounds awful. So what we can look at then is heritability. And we look at, go back a slide, sorry, I didn't mean to jump forward. Heritability, we look at twin and adoption studies, which allows us to estimate the heritability of any given trait. So heritability refers to the extent to which differences among people are attributable to genes. Now, these percentages are fluid depending on the environment. Now, that sounds a little counterintuitive, but let me explain. Mark Twain did this famous examination of personality development. It said, what would happen if we took two infants and we put them in barrels until they were 12, and we fed them through a hole and we didn't give them any access to anything but the food fed through the hole. Of course, practically that wouldn't work, and ethically that's extremely awful. But if we did that, they had the exact same environment, 100%, nothing was different, then almost every one of their characteristics would be the result of genes. I say almost because they do have that mental difference, that mental environment that is a little bit different. But for the most part, if we did this, if we controlled for every single environmental factor, then we would find that it's all genetic. So what this means is that if you have a more homogeneous environment, then you're going to see a greater impact of genes. If you have a more diverse environment, then you're going to see a greater impact of environment. So it's fluid depending on that environment. So this is where we get back to that question of nature versus nurture. And what did I say the first time? I said it's not nature versus nurture. It's nature and nurture. So genes set the stage, and the environment places you on that continuum. I can't remember who it was that said it, but another way of looking at that is, that genes deal the hand of cards, and the environment plays that hand. So genes are self-regulating, and they dictate that phenotype based on what's best for a situation. So let's go back to the example that I used in the first lecture of height. Okay, so if we have an individual that's placed, actually I think this was just in the comment thread. So let me start at the beginning with the height example. If we have two identical twins, and we take them and they have the exact same genes, and we put them in one environment where they're neglected, and we put them in another environment where they have access to everything that they might need. The neglected child, who doesn't have as much access to food and who isn't given as much care, would be, understandably, shorter. On the other hand, the other child that had access to all the nutritional needs that they needed, they would be taller. It makes perfect sense, right? So you take two identical seeds, you put them in the soil, you put one of them in the closet, and you put one of them in the sun. Which one's going to grow, right? So we can look at height in this way. Now, what I mean by saying that they're self-regulating and that they dictate that phenotype based on what's best for the situation is that, sure, the amount of food impacts the ability of that child to grow. But it's more than just that. The body is primed for that expectation that the environment will always be that negligent. So it doesn't make sense for the body to devote more resources than necessary to attain a greater height, because there's no reason for the body to expect that resources will become available to sustain that height. So what this is known as is a gene-environment interaction. So the environment triggers that gene activity, but then the gene activity can actually influence the environment as well. So the height example again, we've got a kid, and the environment, say, aging and access to good food, that triggers the activity or the gene activity for a growth spurt. Well, that growth spurt is going to influence the environment again, because not only is that kid going to need more food, but they're also going to start buying bigger clothes, they're going to get treated differently by their peers, so on and so forth. So this is an example of how the genes and the environment are constantly impacting one another. Another example is temperament. So let's say that you were born as a difficult baby. That doesn't mean that you're going to be an asshole when you get older, but let's just say that you're born as a difficult baby. That's going to change how your parents interact with you as an infant. And how your parents interact with you as an infant is going to set the pattern for how they interact with you as you go on and you develop throughout the rest of your life. So that will in turn change your genetic structure, because that changes what genes get turned on. The chemicals that go through your brain through any one of those interactions. Let's say that your parents are more likely to yell at you because you had a difficult temperament as an infant. So that will then change the chemical structure of your brain. You may become more prone to depression, right? And then that might have another impact on what you eat. And then you might gain weight and then get more depressed. And so it's very cyclical, and it's hard to parse out the specific contributions of gene and environment because they're constantly evolving and changing. And on top of that, you've got to throw into the mix the fact that you often choose your environment. So what do I mean by choosing environment? Well, there's a number of studies that are really interesting that look at competition amongst peers. And what they find is that oftentimes children don't like to compete with their very close friends. So when I was young, at one point I wanted to be an artist. But my best friend wanted to be an artist too. And she was better than me. And so I moved away from being an artist. Now she's an art teacher. She's a great artist. I'm still all right at art, but it's not something that I developed because that wasn't the environment that I chose. I chose to go a different route. I thought, well, if I'm not going to beat Emily at art, maybe I can beat her at science. And that way we won't have to compete. I chose the environment of science. Now, evolutionary psychology is less focused on what makes us different and more focused on what makes us the same. Because what makes us the same is what has enabled us to survive as a species. So the first question is, what is natural selection? Well, natural selection is when we have an experience in the environment that kills off a subset of the population. At its most rudimentary level, that is natural selection. So let's say, we're birds, and all of a sudden our primary food source is no longer available. And the only food source that's available is a rather large nut. Well, those that don't have beaks large enough to consume that nut die. So it's not really survival of the fittest. It's actually killing off of the least fit. Because what's fit now may not be fit tomorrow. So as Grandpa Simpson says, I used to be with it, but then they changed what it was. Now, what I'm with isn't it, and what it is seems weird and scary to me. It'll happen to you too. So what I mean by this quote, and what, Grandpa Simpson meant was a little bit different. He meant, trends and cultural behaviors. But it's true with survival of the fittest. When we say survival of the fittest, that makes it sound like there's some, supreme, most beneficial way to be a human being. And that's just not true. And in fact, if that was true, that would actually be very bad. So if we look at, dog breeds, we find that dog breeds often have a lot of genetic problems. I'm going to go with German Shepherds because I was raised with them, so I know them best. German Shepherds have a really big problem with hip dysplasia, right? Because they have a very small genetic variability. So if it was some golden ideal for humanity, well then what would happen if that golden ideal was no longer the ideal? So what it comes down to is actually genetic variability is the most important thing, and in one central component that puts a pressure on the environment, it's best to be fit in that category. Feel free to ask me any questions on that in the lecture, or in the lecture discussion. I know that I read a study at one point that found that I think it was only about 40% of evolutionary biologists thoroughly understood evolution. So evolution is very complex. It's very challenging to understand. I think I have a good handle on it, but I certainly am not an expert on it. But it's something that I do like to teach from, so please feel free to ask me questions on evolution and how that works. But it's really important to understand that it's not a golden ideal, but rather an ideal for a specific situation. And so if we all fit into this one singular mold, we would probably die off pretty darn quickly. Now, the way selection works is in a couple of different ways, but it all comes down to sex. The first is environmental pressures. This one is the less sexually themed of most of the other two. Environmental pressures are the bird example that I gave you. That's when something happens in the environment that impacts the ability of an individual within a species to survive. So if you happen to have been born, luckily, with a very large beak, well then hey, you get to survive. All those other guys with the tiny beaks, they die off. Now, where it comes down to sex with this is that not only do they die off and their offspring die off, but you, with your large beak, get to produce even more offspring. And so you perpetuate your genetic structure into the future. Another interesting component of selection is what's known as sexual selection. So in this instance, it's sexual pressure. And that's why I have this beautiful peacock over here. Now, there's a hypothesis as to why the males of any given species have these large displays. So whether or not it's the color of a bird, or the comb that comes up on a rooster, these sexually dimorphic traits where males are more ornate than the females come down to a really interesting hypothesis regarding the resources available in your body. And it goes a little something like this. If the male of a species is able to maintain a large ornament, like this amazing plumage, then that means that they're very likely to be healthy and genetically well off. We see this with men's preferences for women as well. Men prefer women that are more attractive, and that's in large part believed to be because women who are more attractive are logically more genetically fit, and we found this in studies to be somewhat true, and that they have a better genetic soup, so to speak. They're more likely to produce healthier offspring. And so this is what we're talking about with sexual pressure. But interestingly enough, sexual pressure doesn't have to be all about survival. There's actually also some indication that it's not always about survival, but also about enjoyment. So we see that of most other mammals, for their body weight, humans actually have some of the largest phalluses of any other species. Not the largest, absolutely not the largest, and we're looking at body weight ratios, so we're not looking at necessarily, sheer size, but we're looking at a ratio of comparison from penis size to body weight. And what we see is that, for the most part, humans have larger penises in comparison to their body size than many other species, and the rationale for this is that humans don't only mate when the women are fertile, humans mate for pleasure, and so women are more likely to choose mates that can sexually satisfy them. And as a result of that, the men that are better able, genetically speaking, to sexually satisfy their women produce more offspring. Makes perfect sense, right? So that's an example of sexual pressure. And then this last one, which is domestication and breeding, is far more recent. Now, domestication and breeding have ancient roots, but it's something that really didn't come about until humans started doing it. So domestication and breeding all come down to a human being selecting for specific traits within an animal. So let's say that we want a cuddly dog, right? So what we would then do is we would choose the most cuddly dog from one litter, and then another really cuddly dog from another litter, and we would mate them. And then we would choose the offsprings that are the most cuddly, and we would do this time and time again until we wound up developing exactly what we looked for. And so this is part of why we see such a wide variety in dog breeds, is domestication, but also the choice to breed those individual groups for the genetic components that drive whatever characteristic we're looking for. Unfortunately, this is also why we see that largely homogeneous structures of genes that are present in those dog breeds results in a lot more diseases and a lot more problems as they develop. And this is because we're looking for a lot of the same behavioral genes, but a lot of those physical ailments are on the same genetic structure. They're on the same chromosome, or they're, acting in the same general area. So as a result of that, we see far more damaging genes as well as the beneficial genes. This is why when it comes down to it, if you get a mutt, it's probably going to be healthier than if you get a pure breed. I'm not saying don't get a pure breed. Good Lord knows I'm not saying that. I do love German Shepherds. I think they're great, but they're more likely to have health problems than, say, your general old run-of-the-mill mutt. So if we've got these pressures going on, then a really interesting question is, why did evolution make us fat as a species? being fat is a relatively recent phenomenon. I mean, within the past couple hundred years, we've really noticed an explosion in being fat. So why does this happen? Well, when it comes down to our evolutionary history, it was more advantageous for us to choose fatty, carbohydrate-laden foods because they enabled better survival. Because when you're in an environment where these foods are hard to come by, you eat them and they fill you up, and then they leave you with excess energy to burn, so that if you're in a situation where you don't have food for a couple of days, you have a reserve. Now, the problem with that in today's world is that in most countries, or rather most countries that I'm speaking to right now, we have access to grocery stores, we have access to fast food restaurants, we have access to all the food we could ever possibly need. Most people that are listening to this lecture right now have all sorts of access to any type of food that they might possibly want. I live in an area where I could drive 2 miles down the road and I could go to a Korean bakery, or I could drive another mile in the other direction and I could go to a Mediterranean bakery, or I could go 20 feet down the street to the McDonald's right next to me. So we have far greater access to these foods that were once excellent for our survival, but which are now causing a lot of problems. So the only area in evolutionary psychology that's really, really focused on differences is when we're looking at gender differences. So this is the only area where evolutionary psychologists aren't looking about how we're the same, they're interested in how we're different. And once again, not surprising, evolutionary psychology comes down to boning. It all comes down to sex. Now, I've got on the screen here that men are more likely to be sexually liberal, while women are more likely to be sexually conservative. I don't mean this in your typical sense of liberal and conservative politically. That's not what I mean at all. Or even when it comes to sexual preferences, whether or not men are more kinky than women or anything like that. What I'm talking about here is in the choices they make with sexual partners. So men are more likely to agree with and engage in casual sex. Women are less likely to do so. Men think about sex more often than women do. So one of my favorite studies, this is Clark and Hatfield, 1989, and basically what they did was they had a moderately attractive man and a moderately attractive woman approach members of the opposite sex. And what they had these individuals do is the man would approach a woman and say, hey, I've noticed you around. I think you're really attractive. I was wondering if you'd like to come back to my place later on tonight and have sex. Not surprising, 0 women took him up on that offer. In fact, some of them called him a creep. Thought he was gross. Now, of the men, a shocking 75% said, yeah, let's do it. In fact, some of them were even like, why do we have to wait till tonight? My room's open. Let's go. So this is a perfect example of these gender differences that evolutionary psychologists look at. Now, why might this be true? Well, we have to look at a plausible explanation. Now, we can't look into the genes and read them and figure out exactly why this is, but we can figure out reasons that make sense. And we can form hypotheses with them and observe them over time and see if they hold true. And one of the most interesting hypotheses, and probably the most accurate, is resources. So men have unlimited genetic resources. I mean, all it takes for a man to become a father is to shoot one load, right? I read a news article about a man that had fathered like 130 children through donation of sperm, because he had a great genetic profile, and so he was highly valuable, and he wound up fathering a bunch of children without really putting much effort into it. Women, on the other hand, have a 9-month commitment to carrying the child alone. So they have limited resources. In addition, men produce viable sperm all the way almost until they die. Women, on the other hand, go through menopause. So again, they have limited resources. As a result, women tend to be more conservative with their mate selection because they want to be convinced that not only is the male a good genetic specimen, but that he is likely to stick around and care for those offspring and provide resources to make sure that those offspring are well taken care of. So this is part of why we believe and we hypothesize that women are more interested in making sure that their mate has a good job, whereas men don't really care if their mate has a good job. So women want resources because they have offspring to care about. You know, women generally, and this is a very general term, this isn't going to carry for all situations, but women are more than likely to be the primary caregiver of a child. And so they put more stock into these. Men, on the other hand, have the extreme desire to spread their genes as far and as wide as possible. That means impregnating as many women as they possibly can. Now, this isn't a conscious choice. This isn't something that men say, hey, you know what? I'm going to knock up as many women as I possibly can. It's not really like that. Instead, what it is that their body wants to have sex with as many possible partners to produce as many offspring as possible, because in doing so, they not only spread their genetic seed farther, but by spreading it with multiple partners, they are more likely to have healthy offspring. Because let's say that you have a similar genetic structure to your spouse or your significant other, and you have a whole bunch of children. Well, they're more likely to have the same diseases because they're getting genes from the same two people. But if a man goes out and has sex with multiple people, he's far more likely to have more healthy offspring that survive into adulthood and then pass on their genes as well. So that's it for behavioral genetics and evolutionary psychology. It's a very rich field. There's a lot more I could go into, but I'm going to leave it at this for now. Feel free to ask me questions. I'm going to leave you with one last snippet of information that I find particularly interesting. Men are more concerned with attractiveness than women, and this is especially true when you consider that this has nothing to do with the opposite sex or attraction to the opposite sex. They find that this is true for gay men and women as well. They find that gay men are more interested in attractive mates than lesbians are. So this is an inherent trait to men and women. Men prefer that attraction. Women are less concerned with that. So I'm going to leave it at that. Ask me questions on the discussion thread. Ask each other questions. I'm going to post some discussion questions, and we're just going to have a good time. And thank you for listening. Have a great day.